Hi, I'm Anna Marie Cox. Welcome to With Friends Like These. Have a great show for you today. I'm going to talk to Graham Wood, who's a writer for The Atlantic, who recently profiled Richard Spencer, the white nationalist, and talk to Franchesca Ramsey, who's the host of Decoded on MTV and a writer, activist, actress. And it's funny, when I was putting the show together, I didn't think that it had a theme. I just thought, well, these are two interesting people whose work deals with difference. Graham Wood usually writes about ISIS, and his piece about Richard Spencer wound up sort of almost drawing from that. We talk about that, but he went to high school with Richard Spencer. So I thought, with friends like these, what a perfect kind of parallel subject for him. And then Franchesca is always dealing with, wokeness on Decoded, and finding ways to use humor to get to uncomfortable topics. So I thought it was just sort of a natural fit for the show. I didn't realize that we have a theme, and that theme is empathy, a little more explicitly than usual, about the limits and costs of having empathy for someone who doesn't just disagree with you, but whose ideas are loathsome or even antithetical to your existence. What does it mean to have empathy for those people? And why should you? And what does it do to you? So that's the big question, and that's the one I get into pretty explicitly with Graham. So you'll want to hang on for that. The first part of the show, however, is coming right up, and that's my interview with Franchesca Ramsey. All right, well, welcome to the show, Franchesca Ramsey, actress, writer, hostess of Decoded on MTV. How are you?
I'm doing good.
Are you really? Because I sometimes I have to think about that all the time now. Are you really doing good?
It's weird. I will say I do feel conflicted because there's so much turmoil in the world, but personally, I've been having a really good year, just career-wise, and my marriage is freaking strong. I'm some days I don't want to talk about how good I feel because I realize a lot of people are stressed out, and very rightly so.
Right. I mean, so the phrase that I've been using is Trump-adjusted terms. So. For living under President Trump, I'm doing well. Thank you. That is
okay. I like that. I'm going to start using that.
And it's just true. What's interesting, maybe this will get us right into our conversation, because what I find interesting about that statement is that, as a fairly privileged, white, cis, straight, married, upper income lady, that's been true for all of my life, right? I'm doing great compared to most people. I just have been. There's no time. I've had my issues that I struggle with,
right.
Personal, whatever, mental health, whatnot, family tragedy. But my life has been pretty fucking charmed. And
yeah.
And it's just having Trump as president has made me aware of that.
Right. Well, I mean, even for me, it's I can sympathize in some respects that I was very fortunate to have come from a two-parent household, and be middle class. And, I can also acknowledge my privilege as a straight cis woman. But with that said, I feel what's going on in the world, especially in our country right now, while some of it doesn't directly affect me, it can just really weigh on you. It feels sometimes there's all of these things are so big and you can't actually do anything about it. And the more stories you hear about people who are directly impacted, especially for LGBT folks and immigrants, and just as a woman, especially with the things that are happening with healthcare and Planned Parenthood, even though the fact that I have healthcare, it still is really scary. And I think in some ways, the fact that some things don't directly impact me make it, just as difficult, because you do feel this disconnect between it actually influencing your daily life. And, if you're an empathetic person, that can still be really hard to wrestle with.
Yeah. And I just think it's interesting that, I refuse to see this as a silver lining. I don't even hate the term silver lining.
No.
But I can kind of get my head around and maybe agree with the idea that there's an opportunity available with Trump becoming
Absolutely.
president, because we were
Yeah,
just
I
as
look at it the same
racist,
way.
just as sexist before he was president, you
Right.
know, but we didn't realize it. Like, or a lot, you maybe, I shouldn't say that we. The
Yeah,
we
I
there
mean,
is kind of unclear, but I guess a lot of people didn't
yeah,
realize it.
I think a lot of us realized it,
Yeah.
but a lot of people are having their eyes open to it. And I like the way of you phrasing it as an opportunity. And I do think this is an opportunity for us to have difficult conversations with our friends, with our family members, with our coworkers that maybe we didn't feel like we had a starting off point for these conversations in the past. It's unfortunate that it has taken this new administration to get us here. But I think, I'm looking at the media landscape and I'm seeing so many people using their platforms and using their voices to talk about, the way these issues are impacting them, but also to really kind of call out privileged folks who never cared about these issues to begin with. So I do think that that's a positive thing.
And that gets us sort of right into one of the things I wanted to talk to you about the most, which is the color of late night. So you and I actually met on the set of the Nightly Show, Larry Wilmore's show, which you were in. That show is now canceled. So now there's this boom in late night comedy, right? Like there are better ratings than ever. Everyone's become political. There was just today, like, let's play the world's smallest violin for Jimmy Fallon. Apparently he feels bad about his Trump interview. And he's the one who's doing worst in late night, right? Because he's a fucking,
and he's never really been a political commentator.
Oh God, no. Like he's like the opposite, right? I wonder, I guess like they have Questlove. So like, I mean, do they feel like they don't need to mention politics? Otherwise, like, I wonder, I've interviewed Questlove before. I kind of want to interview him again because he's very aware,
Right.
And
but I mean, even look at that. They have Questlove like in the band. So it's like, yeah, you have Questlove and you're not even giving him
a voice,
the platform to really like use his voice.
Like literally voice, right?
Yeah. He's literally your like backup, which is bizarre.
But Sam B, Colbert, Seth Meyers, like all these, Trevor Noah, I guess we can count him.
Yeah, absolutely.
We can count him, sure. But it's pretty fucking white,
Yeah.
And
well, yeah.
I feel like there's another answer in that sigh. Tell me more.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I think that it's really awesome that so many people are using their platforms to talk about Trump in a critical way. And I feel like this is the same thing that happened in 2000 with Bush. Like that was the golden age of The Daily Show. And I think that that's what comedy's job is to speak truth to power and to give us a break, especially in hard times. As for why there isn't more diversity in late night, I mean, I can't really say one way or another, like that there's a specific reason for that. But I think that throughout history, people have given opportunities to folks that look like them. And unfortunately, in mainstream media, like it is still a very white space. But I'm glad that that's changing. Robin Thede, who I also worked with at Nightly Show, has a project coming out on BET. And of course, we've got Trevor Noah, and I'm super excited to be working on a pilot at Comedy Central. And I think that what we're seeing is more diverse voices on television, period. And the response from audiences has been so positive that, we're in a space where networks can't help but continue to give us opportunities because our voices are needed, but it's also profitable. Like people want to see people that look like them on TV and also just hear different perspectives.
Yeah. We here at Crooked Media say capitalism is our Kickstarter. So I'm as an old timey Marxist, I'm a little bit suspicious of capitalism as an engine to create change. But, sure, like it sort of seems to be working. It's a little bit now after hundreds of years of not working, but Yeah,
I mean, I try to be an optimist in the sense that like, I think that there's a net positive, right? Yeah. And so I think the more opportunities to see and hear different perspectives on television, the better. And representation has so many positive outcomes, not just for, the chance to see a Black woman in late night is amazing, but it also isn't just for Black young women or girls that are seeing that. It's just people who maybe live in parts of the country who don't know any Black people and have never been exposed to that perspective before, and just humanizing people in a way that they maybe don't realize some of the preconceptions that they have about that demographic or that type of person. Just seeing them as like a normal, fully fleshed person that has a sense of humor and a perspective on the world around them, like, is a really positive thing.
Blacks, they're just like us. Is that what?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And they have sense of humor. This is wild.
I think that you have a good point, and we talk about that on this show a fair amount, like the idea that you get to know people unlike yourself, and you realize you do have this, what seems like it should be intuitive, but isn't. That people who are different you have more in common with people who are different than you have differences usually, because we share all the genes and stuff and human experiences. But of course, like
and to that point, differences aren't a bad thing. I think that that's important to note too. That like it's okay to acknowledge that you and I are different and have different experiences. It's not inherently a bad thing. And I think sometimes people are too quick to be like, we're all the same, we all bleed red. It's like, technically, yes. But we move through the world very differently, and it's okay to acknowledge that. Right.
That's the tension, right? And that's actually something that I definitely value. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this show is to actually talk about the differences that especially I think white people want to be like, you know what? Hey, I have Black friends and Latino friends now, so I don't have to talk about it anymore. Right? I don't have to actually ask them about their experiences. And I sort of want to get to that, which is that, so there's this tension between one reason why you want representation, both in like your personal relationships and in media, is to see the commonalities. But the other reason you want representation is to hear about the differences, right? Like those two things go together. It's not, and I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you, and I feel a little dumb asking this, but I'm going to go ahead and ask, is that, so it is a pretty white late night. The criticisms that are coming about Trump in comedy are coming largely from white voices, although Sam B has a fairly diverse writer's room and representation. But that comedy about Trump is so critical. I do feel like I hear this like nagging conservative voice in the back of my head that probably is my in-laws, asking, well, how would having people of color make the same jokes be different? What would we get if we had more people of color doing comedy about the president?
I think it's a matter of like self-reflection and also personal connection to Trump's policies and the way that they are impacting people. And I think that's a big part of why Sam B is so great, right? Because as a woman, the passion that she delivers when talking about Planned Parenthood or, healthcare is going to be very different from a straight white cis dude who, is not really going to have the same connection to Planned Parenthood services within his personal life or within his friends. And I feel, it's the same for people of color. There's going to be a level of understanding about these issues because for many of us, they hit us in a very personal way.
Right. And also, I do think that one thing, actually, we joked about at the very beginning, but I think one thing that having a diverse set of voices, especially people of color, but also it would be nice to also hear from disabled community in comedy about Trump.
Oh my God. Absolutely.
Because I interviewed Alice Wong on this show and she's hilarious, number one. And number two, she was so great about pointing out, the things that she doesn't like about Trump. I brought up him making fun of the reporter, the disabled reporter, as something that, that probably made you angry or whatever. And she said, not really compared to what he's doing to Medicaid. And I was like, and I was like,
and the services that are really impacting people with disabilities. And even when we talk about healthcare, I thought it was so interesting that freaking Miss USA went on and on about how healthcare is a privilege. And because of a job. And not that we should be looking at Miss USA as like a beacon of intelligence, but like what she said, I think was really like symptomatic of the way a lot of people think about healthcare. They're like, well, if you have a job, then you have healthcare. And it's like, there are people with disabilities who physically cannot work. Like they can't work and they still need healthcare, you know?
And also we are almost unique among nations in doing healthcare that way. Like that we are like considered fucking savages by a lot of the world.
Like, oftentimes the way that we talk about issues is really just like completely leaves people with disabilities out of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we really have to change the way that we talk about people with disabilities, in that they are fully formed humans that like deserve the same rights as us, but at the same time have different needs and challenges. And it's really unfair to just say like, well, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, when like not everyone has the ability, like quite literally the ability to do that. And so again, it would be really great to see more voices in media that come from those different walks of life that are going to actually be affected by these things, and, you know, can talk about them in a way that someone like myself, an able-bodied person or a straight person, is going to say, oh crap, I did not think about that issue and how it was going to affect people that don't look like me.
And I just feel even like people coming from those communities would see different things to make fun of about Trump.
Oh, right.
You know, because like I feel like there's the trope that you know we have in, you know, sort of mainstream late night comedy criticisms of Trump are largely like he's dumb and he's arrogant. Or
he has small hands.
Right.
He has a small dick. It's just like, okay, great. Like, personally, I remember when there was like this giant Trump statue that was popping up when it was like him naked.
Yeah.
And everyone was like laughing about how funny it was that they gave this statue a small dick. And I just kept thinking to myself, like, not that I want to advocate for Trump, but like, I really don't give a shit, like, if he has a small dick, because like that has nothing to do with why I dislike him. And to me, I felt like that was just such a lazy joke that required no actual like skill or talent. Like that is a grade school like bully type of joke, you know?
Yeah.
And not to mention the fact like there are other people in this world who are like nice people and don't treat people like crap, who have small dicks. And like,
right. I was going to say, like, it sounds really weird, but like, let's not center everything on the genitals. Like, that's what, as feminists, like, we're trying, right, and people who care about gender, people who want to acknowledge like a spectrum of gender and a spectrum of sexuality, like, we really kind of want to get away.
Absolutely. It's like, how can you be so upset about Trump's like grab her by the pussy comments and then turn right around and be like, yeah, well, he's like this because he has a small dick. And it's like, are you like missing the fact that you are boiling down someone's humanity to their genitals? A terrible person. Like, don't get me wrong. But I think people have to remember that there are consequences to the things that they say outside of that one person. Like, the people who are hearing that dumb joke are also affected by it in the way that they connect to that joke and who the joke is about or what the joke is about.
Yeah, I do want to emphasize, I do think he probably has a small penis. Like, I'm just going to, I think that's
all on you.
It's all on me, but I'm just going to say, I do think that's probably true. But here's actually the reason why I even make that joke at the end of the conversation about why that's a problematic joke to make, is I do think the one defense of it is that is something that would get to him. Like, that is, you know, it's actually also a sort of meta commentary on his values.
Yeah.
In that he probably cares a lot about what people think of the size of his.
Yeah,
cock.
I mean, that's true. But for me, I think about like why. I think that to pull back, the bigger issue is like, why does he place so much value in that? And in reality, he's not the only person that does that.
No, he's not.
Joke outside of him, you know, and like that's what I think of. I think of like all of the people who hear that joke or hear that criticism and apply it to themselves or to their partner. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know. I really try to express like a level of empathy in my comedy. And that's not easy. Like, there's a lot of jokes that are like, oh, that's a funny joke, but is it a good joke? Like, what are the consequences of that joke? And that's something that I really try to be thoughtful about, because I want people from all backgrounds to be able to enjoy my work. And I never want anybody to watch. I mean, it's inevitable. Like, you can't never offend someone, but as much as possible, I really want to make sure that people can enjoy my work and not feel alienated or not feel like they are the target of what I'm saying.
That gets us to a question that I had for you about Decoded and about what you're doing with your comedy, which is like, I think I wrote you that it's about waking people, but now I also want to call it woking people. And comedy is a great place to do that, right? Like a great avenue in. But it seems also especially difficult, sort of for the reasons that you're talking about,
right.
Because one thing comedy is about is breaking boundaries, saying rude things, walking the edge of insult, even if you don't insult. It's about extremes. Like, that's, someone told me, I remember, like, some language arts class in junior high or something. I remember one of the first things that, like, someone tried to articulate. The first ever time I ever thought about comedy as a thing you could talk about as a subject, I remember a teacher saying that comedy was about extremes. So how do you do that? Like, what is your sense of, when you walk into this project, what lines are you thinking about?
I mean, for us, we really try to make Decoded about answering questions. And that was really like the purpose of our show, all the way down to the name. Just like, what does this mean? Where does this come from? And so we really try to put ourselves in our audience's shoes, but we also try to look at it from a variety of perspectives, so that we can ask the uncomfortable questions that people might have about race and identity, and then we can find funny ways to answer them. And it's, of course, not easy. I said that we really try, and I personally try to go out of my way to make sure that our work is accessible, but there are lots of people who swear up and down that our show is about hating white people. Even sometimes when there's an episode where the word white is not even mentioned, people just swear up and down that it's about them. And I think that really speaks to people's discomfort when it comes to talking about race and identity, because we have really pushed this idea of we're all the same and we don't have to talk about our differences. There are people who are always going to be uncomfortable acknowledging it, especially when it makes them feel as if they've done something wrong or they're complicit in someone's mistreatment or oppression. And so while that's unfortunate, I can't do anything about that. And instead, what we try to do is find humorous ways to be honest, and poke fun at, ignorance and things that can be hurtful, but in a way that's empowering for the people who are on the receiving end of that hurt.
You mentioned something that is a watchword of the show, which is, discomfort is a tool of oppression, in the sense that, white people will do almost anything to remain comfortable, right?
Right.
I think that it's uncomfortable to, again, I think what's interesting, and you did something about this, which is racist, the white people's inward. Which I think is a great way of framing the idea, because I understand exactly what you're talking about, and it's something we've talked about on the show before, which is that the thing that that white people hate the most is being called racist, and it's because that makes them have to think about it. And now my opinion is actually that's not even a useful thing to do anymore, because it's such a explosive term. Like, I prefer to talk about white supremacy, which seems like it'd be more explosive, but in a way, like, I think is a better description of what happens in life, is that we are part of a structure of white supremacy. It's not that individual people are not, I mean, there are racists.
Yeah, and that's really hard for people to understand. And that's something that we talk about a lot on our show, is that, like, actions can be racist. It doesn't necessarily mean that you as an individual are walking through the world believing that you are the supreme race and everyone is beneath you. There's a lot of unconscious bias that presents itself in our daily lives that we don't realize we are buying into, like, that our system is perpetuating. And so, yes, there are individuals who actively participate in upholding white supremacy. And then there are, more often than not, people that don't acknowledge it or don't realize it because we've worked so hard to pretend it doesn't exist, that they are reinforcing it without even realizing it.
Yeah. I actually was thinking about, you mentioned, having uncomfortable conversations, and you work to use humor and all that. And you've done so many different hot button topics, right? On your
Mm-hmm.
show series. I don't know, what do we call these things that are on?
It's a web series.
It's a web series, sure.
You can call it a show.
A show, sure. And I presume if on your show that will may be happening, you might do this as well.
Mm-hmm.
Are there things that you're still uncomfortable talking about yourself, or uncomfortable about bringing to people's attention?
Yeah, it's funny. My nickname in college was Prudy because I hate talking about sex. And when my friends talk about their sex lives, I always get really uncomfortable. And I think I'm just like a very private person in that respect. But I do think there are a lot of stigmas around sex and sexuality, especially with, people who have sexual needs that are different from our own, whether it's their sexuality or, what they participate in with their partner consensually.
What they're into is, I believe, what we call it sometimes.
Yes, there's just like a lot of stigma around that. And I realize I buy into it in the sense that, like, I feel uncomfortable when people talk about their sex lives. I feel uncomfortable or I'm confused when, I know someone that's polyamorous and I love her very much. And I remember when she told me, I was just so confused. And I thought to myself, I don't feel good about the fact that I am like harboring some sort of judgment here. And I don't know why. Like, she's happy, her partners are happy. Like, why am I so uncomfortable with this?
Well, here's I'm going to channel my inner in-law and ask a question about that, which is that I can just hear my mother-in-law's voice so clearly about this. Well, you shouldn't be uncomfortable because that's naughty stuff. That's stuff that you're not supposed to talk about in public. And also, she's doing something that is against human nature. And therefore, we have an instinctual response to it of, disgust, which is totally appropriate. And I want to make clear that I'm channeling a conservative voice that is not my actual thought. But what is the response to that?
For me, I'm always of the mind that if you are not hurting yourself or anyone else, that, like, I am totally okay with it. And what consenting adults choose to do in the bedroom is really not my business. And so for me, it was less about thinking about naughty things, but I think it was, again, more of a reflection of myself of like, oh my God, I could never do that. I would never be okay with that. And applying that to her relationship and realizing that I have to let that judgment go because what she's doing with her partners has nothing to do with me. But I also realize that is a very still taboo type of relationship and conversation. And I do think that that's something for that reason that's worth exploring, because I know it's something that if I felt that sort of weirdness about it, and I consider myself to be a very liberal, open-minded person, I'm sure there are way more people that feel that way too, and all the more reason to explore that, to hopefully destigmatize it and give people a chance to be who they really are. I'm sure there are people who would like to be in those types of relationships, but are afraid to because of the social stigmas.
And I actually think the way to talk about that with people who have, who think that they are channeling a conservative worldview when they comment on it, is, you're the one who's thinking about the naughty stuff.
Right.
Like, you're the one who's thinking about what they do in the bedroom. Like, I mean, if that's disturbing to you, then you should not think about it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I say so often to people who have criticisms of like LGBT folk. It's like, no one is forcing you to think about like what they do in the bathroom or what they do in the bedroom. Like, you are the one that is deciding to do that, and it actually doesn't affect you at all. So with that said, it was kind of a hard pill for me to swallow, that I needed to have that conversation with myself. But it's one that I'm open to talking about, because I kind of think too often we're afraid to acknowledge our own bias and our own mistakes, and how we need to learn from them. And I mean, for me, that's a big part of what my work is about, doing that in a funny way that hopefully makes more people open to acknowledging where they need to learn and where they need to grow, because I'm trying to do that myself.
Do you have any uncomfortable conversations in your life with people you disagree with?
Yeah, I do. I am trying not to have them online because it's just, I found, not productive. I feel like, and I used to do more of it. Like, I used to be way more willing to engage with trolls or people that would just say really hateful, ignorant things to me on the internet. I really found it empowering oftentimes to kind of assert my opinion and really kind of like school people. But I realized that that's just like not really a productive use of my time. I don't think the other person gets anything out of it. And I think just like the performative nature of the internet makes it just a really bad place to have those conversations. So I'm trying to really talk to more people offline, have more phone calls. And actually, I've been talking to someone over the course of a month who considers himself to be an anti-feminist. And the way that we got connected is that he made some videos about me. There's like a huge genre of people talking about how much they dislike me on YouTube. It's really quite interesting. And I reached out to him just to try and get a better understanding of like why he makes this content, and why he feels the way that he does about my work and just feminism in general. And it's been really eye-opening. Like, there's still a lot of things that we don't agree on, but I think that a lot of things were confirmed for me that I already knew, but just needed to hear from someone else, that like a lot of the criticisms that he has about feminism and about social justice are really more about him and not about, the people that are advocating for these issues. And also just like a lack of understanding and a feeling of guilt on certain things. And it's been really eye-opening, and I'm really hoping to use some of that in my work going forward, because I think the way that we talk about these issues is not reaching there are certain people that it's just not reaching. And that was a big part of why I wanted to talk to him, just to understand like how he's interpreting my content and how he's interpreting these conversations, and figuring out what that disconnect is.
Yeah, I think that there's a real interesting sort of meta conversation. Maybe it's not a conversation because it's being conducted in actions and not words, but it's an interesting moment for how one interacts with those who not just disagree with you, right? I mean, because I think like when we talk about Trump supporters versus progressives, as my friends in the mostly LGBTQ community remind me, like, this isn't just about they don't like these people, right? Like, it's you should not exist,
right? And
on the one hand, it's not just, again, is where we've progressed beyond a place of disagreement in our politics. It's now almost existential in terms of the values the different polar sides have. So do you engage, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's like a personal choice. Like, I don't think everyone should have to engage. And I think that, for me, what's really frustrating, and I understand this is frustrating for a lot of people, is this constant mantra of, we need to reach across the aisle. And I don't believe that that's untrue. But for some people, especially the marginalized folks who are most affected by Trump's policies, the people who are really dealing with matters of life and death, the fact that we're constantly being told that we need to prove our humanity to people that don't believe that we deserve the same rights as they do, and have actively supported a man who has said and done really freaking hurtful things, it's like infuriating. It's like, why do I have to be the bigger person? Why do I have to start dialogue with someone who's never wanted to have dialogue with me, who's someone that has never seen me as a fully formed human person? That's really frustrating, especially for people who have these conversations all the time. Just moving through the world as a marginalized person, like we're constantly being asked to explain things to people and prove to people that we should be treated the same as them. And so like that's really freaking frustrating and exhausting. So I get that there are a lot of people who don't want to do it, and I think that they should not have to. That said, I think that some of us, I think that if you have the space to do it, and also I think that that's really the responsibility of people who want to call themselves allies. As a straight person, I have to have tough conversations with my straight friends when and if they say something that is homophobic, or with my other cis friends who say something that's transphobic. My trans friends are tired of having those conversations, which is all the more reason that I should have them and help aid them, because, unfortunately, people who look like me are going to be more receptive to hearing that from me.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting and not stable situation, because there's lots of different centers of gravity on whether or not on the relationships you might have with someone who disagrees with you, who's different than you, who's across the aisle in some way. I agree, like that. I think it's on people who are relatively privileged to practice our own form of respectability politics. Like we need to police our people, tell them pull their pants up and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to call in your own folks.
Yeah.
You need to do it. It's just like, because I've seen it so many times, especially like in the YouTube space. It's really interesting that I can make a video about feminism or about racism and get tons of hateful comments from people that are like, you're lying, you don't know what you're talking about, you're a racist, you hate men, whatever it is. And like a white man can make that same video and like the comments are overwhelmingly positive and saying like, wow, I never thought about it this way. Like you really opened my eyes. And I'm just like, part of me thinks like, that's so annoying. But then the other part of me thinks like, oh, wow, at least they learned something. And because it came through that voice. And so I would rather them learn something than not have their eyes opened at all.
Yeah.
And hopefully now they'll be more receptive to hearing things from me, because this white dude's voice helps filter it and make it more palatable for them.
Well, I await Jimmy Fallon's wokeness video. Like that, I guess, would be the thing that
I will roll my eyes and I will still be thankful that it exists.
All right, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for being on the show. I look forward to seeing you on your show. Do you have any more details about that Comedy Central thing that might be?
No, I mean, there's not much that I can say other than the fact that I'm just excited to kind of talk about identity in a funny way that hopefully is going to reach lots of people.
Yeah.
It's a big challenge, but, with great risk comes great reward. And I'm just really thankful that Comedy Central is open to the idea of tackling identity and social issues in a really fun and cutting edge way. And I feel really fortunate to have that support, and also just the support from my audience. So many people have reached out to say they're excited about the prospect of me having my own show. So that's really helped motivate me and inspire me to just make great stuff.
All right. Well, we'll have you back to talk about it.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Francesca.
You're listening to With Friends Like These with Anna Marie Cox.
At a time when it feels like it's never been harder to find the truth, supporting a free press is critically important. It's important to support people like Francesca, support people like Graham. And in fact, Graham works for The Atlantic. And The Atlantic happens to be available to you via the app Texture. And Texture has supported journalism not just by offering access to great magazines, but also financially. A portion of every subscriber's fee goes to the publishers. The Texture app has gone beyond delivering just the magazine itself. They've made it easy to find and enjoy the articles you want to read with daily recommendations, exclusive interactive features, videos, and more. Texture makes magazines easy. And there are so many great ones out there. I mean, I do read The Atlantic. Texture is actually terrible for me because it always just makes me feel bad about myself because there's so much to read and I don't get to read it all. But it does mean that I only have to carry around my iPad and not a stack of magazines. You can find Vanity Fair, Time, The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, also fun stuff. Domino, the House magazine, Style magazines, Gossip magazines, they're all on there. And it's searchable, and you can mark what you like, and you can check out back issues and view bonus content. And they curate articles and magazines just for you or whoever you are giving Texture to this year. Texture is normally $9.99 a month, and you get over 200 magazines. But if you sign up right now at texture.com/friends, you get a 14-day free trial. Again, that's texture.com/friends and a 14-day free trial. It's not even long enough for you to build up a backlog to feel bad about. Why subscribe to just a couple of magazines when you can have all of your favorites on your smartphone or tablet all the time for way less? Plus, Texture was selected as one of Apple's top 2016 iPad apps. So start your free trial now and download the Texture app. Again, a free 14-day trial to listeners of With Friends Like These. If you go to texture.com/friends, again, 14 days free, texture.com/friends. Welcome to the show, Graham Wood, national correspondent for The Atlantic, also author of the just out, is that correct?
A couple months.
Couple months, that's forever in Trump time, but relatively recent in book time, The Way of the Strangers. And I am sure it's fascinating. I've followed your work at The Atlantic covering the Islamic State, ISIS, terrorism. And I would say that's how I knew who you were. That's kind of your day job, I would guess. But the piece that we're going to talk about is different. Or maybe it's not, actually. You tell me. The piece that I want to talk to you about is this piece that came out recently called His Kampf. And it's a profile of Richard Spencer that you wrote from a very different perspective than your other pieces, I would think. It's about sort of how you went to high school together and a little bit how your paths diverged. But I was, first of all, wondering, did you make a decision to do this kind of personal piece? Was that a conscious thing? Or did you think, oh, I'm Richard Spencer, someone I know, I'm going to write about him, and I happen to go to high school with him?
I had no option but to make this a personal piece. I've known Richard for so long. I have such vivid memories of him when we were adolescents that I think it would have been false for me to try to describe him or profile him just as a grown-up, since I've known him long enough to have watched the progression that he's had from a pretty nondescript high school kid in North Dallas, Texas, to what he's become.
Did it feel different for you to start writing, to start reporting, writing this piece in such a personal way?
There is an aspect to it that does feel very personal because it goes back to who I used to be when I knew him, and that has to be said too for purposes of honesty. But in a lot of my conversations with subjects who are not Richard Spencer, who are people I haven't known for a long time, it's also been important for me to sort of immerse myself in their lives. If they're ISIS supporters, then go to the sermons that they preach, to hang out with their followers. And so in some ways this was less personal than others because just talking to him and having known him before and then finding out what he says now, it's so alienating relative to the familiarity with this personality type that I knew growing up.
That's interesting because I was wondering sort of the parallels and places that the reporting on ISIS and reporting on Richard Spencer diverge. Because one of the fascinating little details is that when you talk to him about your reporting on ISIS, he tells you that your story is really popular in his group, right? Like he says, like your story is really popping with like the alt-right online.
Yeah, he said to me as soon as I met him for the first time in about 10 years, he said, the alt-right kind of likes your writing on ISIS. And I really winced because I said, is it because you're super Islamophobic? Because a lot of Islamophobes have liked that I talked about Islam in the context of the Islamic State. And he said, no, it's because ISIS is like us.
Yes.
In that they are a kind of intellectual movement. People don't recognize them as such. And you actually ask them, what are your ideas? And you don't like their ideas, and you probably don't like my ideas as an alt-right guy. But yeah, it's the same kind of thing. You're asking a group that is reviled and abominated by the mainstream to explain itself. And that's what he was ready to do when I started putting the screws to him.
Right. And you said when your answer to the previous question that when you write about ISIS, it sounds like you said you try to immerse yourself in their culture. And I imagine that in order to hear them as they should be heard, you have to develop some empathy for these people, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, with Richard, the empathy almost comes preloaded because we come from the same milieu, we went to the same school. And with ISIS, you have to hang out with them to realize the ways in which they're different and the ways in which they're the same. So, I would go play soccer with a jihadist cell in Melbourne, Australia, and it would, the aspects of their movement that were alien to me were pretty obvious. They believed in genocide and so on. But then to realize that they also like Monty Python movies, and they are they play the same sports and have the same pop culture that they come from. That took some effort. Whereas with Richard, it was more a kind of task of learning just how much the divergence has happened, rather than with ISIS discovering how much convergence there actually is.
Yeah, I wondered if it was almost an opposite kind of process, in the sense that with ISIS cells, like, you're developing empathy. You're starting from a place of like, I reject this ideology, I reject their values, but I'm going to, figure out what some of their humanity is so I can hear them, right? That's the project. I would think that for me, when I'm interviewing people that I disagree with, the reason I want to develop that empathy is so that I don't blind myself to what they're saying, so they try to hear what they're saying as clearly as possible. But it seems like with Spencer, what might have happened, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is like you start with the empathy, and then it's almost as though you have to work to hang on to it because he's become someone else, right?
Yeah, with Richard, as with ISIS, a lot of people try to psychologize or to describe where the person comes from. In terms of the politics of the place where he grew up, you try to psychologize, you try to come up with some idea of how does someone get to be so screwed up and so weird. And with Richard, having actually known exactly where he comes from, being totally familiar with the types of politics that he would have known growing up, it was definitely an effort of finding out why, given how the huge number of people who started off that way, why is he the only one who's basically a Nazi today? That was the kind of underlying question of my profile.
Then do you feel like you got an answer to that?
I did get an answer. The first explanation that people reach to in the case of Richard is he comes from the South. In the South in the 1990s, everybody was super racist. And I remember racism in Dallas in the 1990s. Of course there was racism there. The answer that I got to how he turned that kind of racism into something completely different, or something at a different league, was surprising to me. The answer was basically that he discovered Wagner, he discovered German culture, and then he went to the University of Chicago, not a place that we usually think of as a breeding ground for white supremacy, but he took a kind of love of German culture and then supercharged it with 1 year worth of graduate school that made him, I got to say, he's a reader. He's someone who really cares about ideas, and he has basically the worst ideas that you could possibly get out of 1 year in grad school at the University of Chicago. But it's not something that you get sitting around with Republicans in the Dallas Country Club or really anywhere else in polite society in Texas.
Right. It was actually sort of the fever dream of his own isolation in a way. I mean, okay, so full disclosure, I went to University of Chicago. Also, I went to a year of grad school elsewhere. So I'm a little defensive. But at the same time, I can see how it happened for him. And I would say, I think it's an interesting question about whether or not you can blame Wagner. And not that you're blaming Wagner, but sort of drawing this direct line. Because what I would say about, having gone to U of C and knowing the culture there and the people there, it's I would say the isolation in the hothouse environment is almost as important, because the other thing about his ideas, which are the most, extreme ideas you can get, is that I don't think you can grow those in any kind of representative sample of normal, American culture, like normal-ish American culture.
I think that's quite right. And as you can attest, U of C is definitely not normal American culture.
Well, what's not normal about it is that it's so isolating and hothouse, right?
And also that it is, it's famous for being a place where ideas can be bandied about in a playful way, in a serious way. And I think that for most of the people who go there, there's an understanding that although you play with ideas, you don't take one and run with it for the rest of your life if it's one that has the implications that his do. I mean, he would talk to the same professors who would, I'm sure, year after year, bring up to their students the idea that maybe democracy is a political system that has an incomplete theorization behind it. There are reasons that one might not like from the perspective of Hobbes or just political philosophy, democracy, and let's talk that through. The conclusion that most people reach is let's keep on talking about that forever. It's an endless conversation, as they used to say in the Chicago Great Books program. Mm-hmm. Whereas with Richard, it was more like, all right, the undercutting of democracy is something that I'm going to go pro with, as he had.
I'm going to actively pursue. Like, he took the sit around getting high, talking about weird ideas to a whole lifestyle. Like the whole provocative question. He took the professor's provocative question that you might get as an essay exam at the end of the year and turned it into his life's work.
And I think that that's one of the things that people get wrong about Richard Spencer. That they assume that because he is a racist, and he's definitely racist, because he's a fascist, and he's definitely fascist, that he is rock-headed, that he has no thinking behind him. And that's not quite right. I mean, he is someone who reads books, and to argue against him, you probably require, for most people, certainly for me, you require a trip to the library to figure out where his ideas come from and what the best responses are. The fact of the matter is we've had so few real fascists in American politics over the last 50 years that we don't really, as normal political actors, have the antibodies for the arguments that he gives. So that's, I think, one reason why he's been so dangerous and really so malignant in our politics is that he makes people think that he's easy to argue against, and actually it takes some work.
And what was it like for you personally, interviewing him, hanging out with him? Because you are not a white person, right, yourself?
I am half white. I have two fully Chinese grandparents and two fully white ones. And
so I'm just wondering if that was something that informed your interactions with him today. I'm just curious, as someone who he would have, he's a racist, right? So what was it like being with him and interviewing him and doing this story and knowing that he's a racist?
Well, on the one hand, I assume he had some awareness that I was not fully white, and probably had looked down on me at some level because of that. I'm used to talking to people who despise me, not because everybody despises me, because of people I seek out to interview.
I was like, be careful.
I'm an infidel.
We only just met. I'm totally...
But no, I think that's another thing that he really profits from, is the expectation that when he's talking to people, he's doing so with a kind of venomous contempt. And that's not really the case. He instead cultivates a very urbane and polite attitude, including towards half-breeds such as myself. It doesn't mean that it doesn't feel filthy to talk to him, but you'd be very impressed at some of the delousing products that are on the market. So, you just gotta do this kind of thing if you're a journalist.
But I am just curious, maybe this is a question that's broader than Richard Spencer, because it is true. You talk to people who think that you're an infidel. And maybe that is something as Americans or as a progressive person or whatever, like that, I don't have a hard time getting my head around like you being in that situation. But for some reason, and maybe it's because it's a fairly personal essay and you knew each other before he had these incredibly loathsome ideas. Like, I just keep thinking about the conversations you must have had with him. And doesn't he at one point, like, you talk about your race with him?
I do, yeah. At one point, he's describing what the boundaries are of this kind of chosen race that would be the ethnic identity of his utopian state. And I ask him, all right, I'm a guy who, I studied in a Western classical tradition. I took 6 years of Latin and so forth, even though I'm half Chinese. I was not educated in a Confucian tradition. So do I count as a half Chinese person? And his answer was kind of jocular. Oh, we're nice people. We'll let you in, which didn't seem all that funny to me. But it wasn't anything that really soured our conversation any more than the previous things that he had said, which were very clearly nostalgic for the Third Reich. So yeah, the fact that I was individually being impugned this way it wasn't any worse than the other things he was saying.
Now, I'm now really just fascinated by the way that writing about ISIS may have prepared you for writing about Richard Spencer, because, I mean, the parallels seem so clear now. I mean, when you're talking to ISIS cell members, do you have personal discomfort, or is that more like I'm a journalist, I'm interviewing them, I know that they hate me, but that's not part of my thought process right now?
Occasionally, when talking to an ISIS supporter, he or she sometimes will say something that is extremely alienating. It's impossible to hear someone say, it would be great if all Yazidis were enslaved or killed, and to continue with the same lighthearted spirit that had characterized the beginning of the conversation. But for me, maybe it's just the beats that I've covered, but almost everyone I've spoken to in my career as a journalist has been, to me, on the wrong track about something, often loathsome in one way or another.
That's your beat, huh?
It matters a lot to me that I have the stamina to listen to a lot of horrible stuff in the hopes of understanding where it comes from, and also in the end how to counter it. But it's one of the occupational hazards of the job, is becoming desensitized to some really atrocious things that people will say to you. For me, after a couple days of listening to an Islamic State supporter talk about slavery, talk about beheadings, genocide, and so forth, I've learned to suppress the puke reflex a bit and just try to listen. That's the same kind of posture that I've had to have toward Richard as well.
You're listening to With Friends Like These with Anna Marie Cox.
So we talk about difference on this show and sort of navigating the tension between everyone being human and everyone being different. One thing that's different between people, this is pretty shameless, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's the way you sleep. So why is your mattress made for everyone? Why is your mattress one size fits all? You can have a truly customized mattress, but it would cost you like $5,000 or $10,000 until now. Go to helixsleep.com and answer a few simple questions, and they will run a 3D biomechanical model of your body through their proprietary algorithms. Ooh, science. They developed with the help of the world's leading ergonomic and biomechanics experts, and the result is the most comfortable mattress you've ever slept on. Helix customers report a 30% improvement in overall sleep quality. And for couples, they customize each side of the mattress. Your mattress arrives at your door in about a week, and shipping is completely free. That is why everyone from GQ Magazine to Forbes are all talking about Helix Sleep. You have 100 nights to try it out, and if you don't love it, they will pick it up for free and give you a full refund. No questions asked. Go to helixsleep.com/Anna and get $50 off your order. That's helixsleep.com/Anna. helixsleep.com/Anna. Get a mattress that is just for you. The concept behind this show is kind of about the idea that we need to listen to people's ideas, even if we find them reprehensible. And having conversations with people you disagree with, people who may even, find you personally objective as a human being, or who have ideas that are, antithetical to your existence. And I've never talked about suppressing the gag reflex, but I have talked about the value of not stopping the conversation, right? The value of somehow being able to continue the conversation, even if you are deeply offended or alienated. And in that respect, I've called upon, my tools as a reporter, because I always feel like if you get offended, the next thing you can ask the question, rather than be offended, you can ask the question, why do you feel that way? Right? Like that somehow can take you beyond the initial, urge to vomit. I wonder, do you feel like and as a journalist, it's easy for me to say, like, there's just value in understanding more. Do you feel like you ever fully understand these people who have these incredibly abhorrent ideas? Like, is there a point at which you're like, okay, I get it? Or is it always going to be kind of like, this is disgusting to me and I cannot, fully incorporated it into how I think people should behave?
I would say with the vast majority of people I've spoken to who are ISIS supporters, and this counts for Richard Spencer too, yes, at some point you do start to sympathize and understand where they're coming from, and to feel like you've got a pretty good handle on it. There are always going to be some people, and I think those would include probably a lot of people who are doing the actual, hacking to death with machetes and the atrocities, rather than just the people who are supporting them passively from the sidelines, as Richard or ISIS supporters in Australia might be. The ones, though, who simply believe, rather than actually taking the step of physically doing something that I could not imagine doing, those ones I think are still within the realm of the comprehensible. There is, though, and I don't think about this too much, but it is something that I suppose we should consider. There might be a point beyond which empathy for a reporter is undesirable. I mean, there's a famous note from Bertrand Russell to Oswald Mosley, the famous British fascist in the 1930s, saying, "Look, I don't really want to talk to you because we're so far apart that there can be nothing gained from conversation." And I can certainly see that might be the case with certain people. That is, that there's something lost to my soul, to my reader's soul, perhaps, if you get to the point where you've put yourself in the mindset of someone who's doing something simply too awful, and the profit from understanding that might be not worth the loss from subjecting yourself to that kind of soul-destroying experience. So far, though, certainly with talking with Richard, but also talking with ISIS supporters, it doesn't feel like the loss is incalculable. It doesn't feel like a moral numbing that will never be repaired. It seems like something we still have to do, because there's enough that is worth understanding, and enough that we gain from that empathy that we really should have.
I think the thing that you might be talking about, or at least is related to what you're talking about in terms of the cost of empathy, is, the idea we talk a lot about normalization, right? Or the acceptability, having something be a part of the acceptable, bounds of discourse. And that's, to me, sort of an overarching question in the Richard Spencer profile, right? And it's something that he sort of talks about, is that we have to deal with him now, right? Like, he has bullied his way into our discourse. And now you have exposed, The Atlantic has exposed, like, all these people to his ideas. And I think, do you feel like that's a cost? Do you feel like that's a discomfort? I mean, to know that, like, I have promoted this person, like, more people, I've given him a platform.
No, I don't think, first of all, that I've promoted him. Now, he has a platform in that people know what his ideas are who didn't know what his ideas were before. And there is profit. There is like some positive social benefit for people to understand what Richard's ideas are, because they need to be fought. They can't be fought if they're misunderstood. So in that sense, I think it's mostly positive. Now, if someone reads this profile of Richard Spencer and his ideas and walks away and says, that guy has everything right, first of all, I would urge them to read a bit more carefully, because that would be a strange takeaway, I think, from this particular profile. And also, I think if that does happen, then we need to face the fact that it might not be because there's a profile in the Atlantic. It might be because he's got ideas that people actually believe in, and it wasn't the Atlantic that made their belief so. It was something that existed before, and that was attractive about his ideas, quite apart from the fact that they read about them in a not especially flattering profile in one magazine.
Yeah, I think something you do a good job of pointing out in the profile is that Richard Spencer didn't create this historical moment, right? Like, Richard Spencer did not create the Trump era. It's not his fault, and he's just available to take advantage of it.
Yeah, I would say yes and no. So Richard is definitely opportunistic. The fact that Trump arose and Trump is what he is, and that Trump is such an empty vessel, too, for the most loathsome kinds of ideologies, he definitely knows that and has taken advantage of it. I think, too, though, that people have to start seeing that Richard's beliefs, they don't come out of nowhere either. Mm-hmm. They have antecedents in the early 20th century in Germany, in Europe in general in the 19th century. Like, he spoke to me quite eloquently, actually, about the kind of nation creation that happened throughout the 19th century, the creation of the German state, the Italian nation, the French, and so forth. And he is involved in his own mind, and I hope not also in reality, in the creation of a similar kind of polity. It's one that wouldn't be recognized during that moment of 19th century nationalism, because it's a pan-national white European movement that elides all those distinctions between European states. But it's the same kind of process, and so it's not quite right to say that he's just a lamprey on the side of ship Trump. He's definitely one that comes out of a much bigger ecosystem, and that's trying to use the lessons of history from at least a couple hundred years back.
I don't mean to say he's like just a parasite. Actually, what I guess I kind of mean is that this, to the degree to which he becomes more prominent, it is not necessarily because his ideas are themselves like so appealing or he's so appealing. It's that we are in this historical moment where the groundwork, like the environment, the economic and, sort of racial moment that we're in, is made his ideology more attractive, perhaps, than it was 20 years ago.
Yes, and I think you're quite right about that. And by the way, there's a very clear parallel with ISIS, too. ISIS, the ideas that they've promulgated have existed in Islam for a long time. Why didn't they exist 30 years ago in a way that was in our headlines on our cable news and so forth? The answer to that is there's a particular historical moment that creates the opportunity for it to flourish. That's the historical moment where we've got chaos in Syria and Iraq, and a whole bunch of countries in the Muslim world that have lost lost the support of their people. Very similar with this. The idea of creating a new nation out of nothing is something that a Richard of the year 1962 or so could have had as well. But right now, there is this kind of the sense that large numbers of Western countries with white people in them historically, white Christian people, are no longer enjoying the support of a kind of critical mass of their population. And so Richard has his moment right now because of that, even though he's using ideas that have existed for a long time.
I want to get back a little bit to the dangers or limits of empathy, because I wasn't actually, when I talked about giving him a platform or a profile, I did not mean to imply that you gave him a flattering profile or that you were somehow, this was a good, made it seem attractive in any way, right? The thing that is in the back of my head, it's going back to this idea of just empathy, which is that I definitely have more empathy for Richard Spencer now. Like, you did a great job. You're a terrific writer. It's a wonderful profile. And there's a, pathos in it, in this story, that, like, part of me is angry at you. I have a little bit of sympathy for him because he seems kind of sad, right? Like, there is sort of a tragedy to him, I think. Maybe it's a tragedy that he earned, that's completely justified, but it's there.
Yeah, so the interviews that I conducted with Richard took place before and after this moment when he was punched in the face on television, to the rejoicing and applause of basically the entire world. So I got to talk to him right after that when he was still bruised and his eardrum was blown out, and it was at a point where he actually seemed kind of sympathetic. I felt sorry for him too. It was kind of you to say that you as a reader felt the same way, but it was not a sympathy that I wanted ever to have with a guy like that. But by the end of the interaction, it was clear that he, like any normal person, was not ready for this. I mean, I don't just mean was not ready to take the punch, but was not ready for the implications of the horrible politics that he espouses, which means having to walk around basically with a bodyguard everywhere he goes so that someone doesn't decide to hit him a bit harder in a way that he won't recover from. I think that sympathy is just something that we should feel and understand that, when we cheer on attacks on Richard, then we don't want it to be normalized, that we would cease to feel sympathy for someone who gets cold cocked. That's something that we should feel always a bit revolted at.
See, I'm on record as being pro-Nazi punching. And I have to say, like, I don't know if I'm anti-Nazi punching anymore, but I would say that I would feel worse about doing it. I mean, I think it's possible to be both someone who wants to see him suffer, not necessarily physically, and then also feel for him in his suffering. If that's makes any sense at all. Like, that's, I feel like, where I am with him right now, which is that I think he should have to suffer for putting, not just putting these ideas in the world, because having the ideas, the thought crime is not the problem, right? The problem is his actively trying to make them happen.
Yes, absolutely. There are some people who think that he has, incited violence in a way that may actually be criminal too. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to take a position on that, but I think that he, having to live the rest of his life in fear, it is. He may not deserve to have to wonder whether he's going to be murdered or assassinated at any given moment for the rest of his life. But he definitely should suffer for the ideas that he's put out there and that he's encouraged other people to have.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the part of me thinks, there are people of color in this world. They have to worry if they're going to be assassinated at any moment because of the ideas that Richard Spencer has, right? So, yeah,
the comparison that I quite liked, which I was surprised to find made so explicit, was this Norman Mailer essay from the 1950s, The White Negro, where he describes exactly that. He basically says that white people in the 1950s and a couple decades before that, they felt like their culture wasn't good enough. They had to reach elsewhere for something that was edgy enough to be adequate to the experience of living in the shadow of the bomb and recent experience of horrible wars and so forth. And so they found the difficulties under which black people had lived, which includes not being able to walk down the street without fear. And Richard has exactly that fear right now. He worries when he walks down the street. In other words, he is subjected to what has been for black people a normal condition for as long as there have been black people in this country. So that's a poetic justice in a way. It's also something that poetic justice and justice are not quite the same thing. But I can appreciate the irony, and I am also not pleased that violence would be, for anyone, part of his daily life.
I think it's amazing. I had wondered if your writing about ISIS had any relationship to this piece, and did you realize it was going to be the parallel when you started, or did you think it was going to be something different?
I resisted the parallel when I started. There were enough people who said, "Oh, Trump is the American ISIS," and said so very glibly, and I think unfairly to Trump. I don't often rise to Trump's defense, but to say that he's genocidal seems to be giving him a little bit too much credit for intention of any kind, even malevolent. So I didn't think to begin with that it was going to take this very ISIS-y turn. But I was forced to bring it in that direction because Richard seemed to be similar enough to individual ISIS people from the United States in his general view, from even coming from Dallas. So the comparison was forced on me.
Thanks again. Great piece. I will check out your book too. Anything else you want to add before we say goodbye?
No. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
It's like I said, the pleasure is mine. Thank you. And that is it for the show. As usual, I must thank you for your patience in making it this far, and then encourage you to rate and review the show on iTunes or wherever it is you get your podcasts. And please subscribe to the show. Subscribe to the entire suite of Crooked Media podcasts, which now includes DeRay McKesson's Pod Save the People, in addition to the lineup that I'm sure you are already familiar with. More important now than ever, I have to say. I know that self-promoting perhaps, but I don't know how I would get through this current political moment without my friends in the pod. I am a friend of the pod, and I have friends on the pod. But isn't the cool thing about all the Pod Save guys that it sort of feels like you're having that after-work discussion that you really want to be able to have with like super smart, informed people who also are frustrated and also really funny? Yeah, that is the reason for those pods. I also want to tell you that you can contact the show via email at withfriendslikepod@gmail.com. Again, that's withfriendslikepod@gmail.com. You can tweet at the show at crooked_friends. You can follow me on Twitter at Anna Marie Cox, and you can follow our guests. Francesca Ramsey is at Chesley, which is CHESCALEIGH. Again, that's CHESCALEIGH. And Graham, thankfully, you won't need to write this one down. He is at GCAW, at GCAW. Feel free to write us with any questions you'd like the show to tackle in the next coming weeks. We are putting together a listener question show and are looking for anything you might want to talk about that has to do with politics and relationships, the way that relationships complicate politics and politics complicate the relationship. And of course, if there's any uncomfortable conversations you think we should be having, let us know. Until next week, again, thanks for listening.